As a young boy, I was not all you want boys to be, somewhat of an odd fish, and on the wayward side. People were always complaining. Mind you, I was no wastrel, but I had a wanderer's soul, and I did not feel particularly inspired to be a good boy. Instead, I longed to see the world, and I longed to know its people. Much of today's story will be about the character who had first awakened the spirit of adventure in me. I met Indranath at a soccer match. We were thoroughly engrossed in our game, enjoying its final moments with the sun just about to set when a brawl started on the field. It spread quickly, and I soon found myself desperately looking for an escape. Suddenly, a boy several years older than me came from nowhere. He was a dark-skinned guy with a big forehead, a pointed nose, and approximately the same size as me. I couldn't help noticing that his hands were so long that they almost fell below his knees. I was still out of breath when he finally managed to extricate me from the chaos on the field. "What's your name?" he asked with a curious, impassive face. "Srikanto," I said. "Good," he responded, and then, bringing some dry leaves out of his pocket, he put them in his mouth and started to chew. Extending his palm with the same leaves toward me, he said, "For you, chew." "What is it?" I asked. "Siddhi. Chew well and then swallow, leaves and sap, everything. It will make you feel lightheaded, really good," he insisted. When I said I have never tried Siddhi and didn't want to either, he looked at me with wild surprise. "You don't want it? What an idiot." He then brought out 2 cigarettes and handed one to me. Lighting his own, he held it within the folds of both his palms, drawing deeply. I stared as almost half the cigarette burned to ashes in that single powerful puff. Then, as I stood there both petrified and paralyzed, expecting to be caught at any moment holding the cigarette by someone who knew me, Indranath ambled away, contentedly smoking. As I write today, I can't quite decide whether I had liked or hated that boy that day, the boy who chewed forbidden shitti and smoked the equally off-limit cigarettes without a care in the world. About a month or so after that occasion, one evening, tormented by the muggy summer heat, most of my family had gone up to our roof to lie under the stars. It was well past midnight, but we lay wide awake, unable to fall asleep. I remember noticing there was no breeze at all, and everything seemed to stand completely still. Suddenly, we heard sounds of flute. It was a beautiful tune. My aunt asked her eldest, "Nobir, who is playing? Is that Indro of the Rise?" I realized that my aunt and my cousins knew the flute player. My cousin responded, "Who else can play like that, mother? And who else do you think will walk through that jungle at this hour?" "What? Do you mean he's on that terribly overgrown path near Goshaibari?" "Yes." My aunt shivered, disconcerted by the image of a lone boy in the middle of that treacherous bit of wilderness. She mumbled, "So many deaths from snake bites there. Does his mother not forbid him? What could he want there at this hour?" When my cousin replied, I could sense him smiling. "That's a shortcut, and that's the only thing Indro cares about." "Unbelievable," my aunt mumbled before falling silent. The flute grew loud and then grew weak again before fading completely. This was the same Indranath who had rescued me that day on the soccer field. Ever since, I have thought of him many times. My desire to meet him again had grown stronger each passing day. Always keen on picking up news about him, I had learned he had recently stopped going to school. He had gotten expelled for playing a prank on a teacher. No one has seen his hide nor hair near the school since, despite his family repeatedly entreating him to go back. Apparently, he also had a small boat, which he sailed on the waters of the Ganga, come rain or shine as he liked. From time to time, he was rumored to vanish on this dinghy of his, not to be seen for days. Rainy season arrived. It had rained all day that day, and as evening fell, the rains had paused, but the sky was still overcast. Finishing our dinner early, my cousins and I began studying in the light of the oil lamp, a routine evening activity for us those days. We were seated on the extra firm mattress in the living room. My uncle dozed on his favorite easy chair by the door. Next to him sat old Ramkamal, his neighbor. Ramkamal was smoking a hookah, his eyes drooping from the opium he had taken. Guards who worked at our house sat in the courtyard, and we could hear them burst into song or laughter from time to time. We studied under our elder cousin Mejda's rigorous supervision. We were all either 3rd or 4th graders, except Mejda, who, having failed to pass the 10th for 2 consecutive years, was now preparing to appear for it a 3rd time. We usually sat with our books from 7:30 to 9. Mejda studied with us, and we weren't allowed to talk to him unless talked to, not even to ask him permission for break. Mejda kept a stack of ready chits handy with things like peeing or drinking water written on them. When someone wanted a break, they would select from his stack of chits and advance it to Mejda. Gravely taking the chit in his hand, Mejda first deliberated on the validity of the applicant's request. If he felt the plea justified, he would record the current time and the allowed duration for the break on the chit before handing it back to the applicant. When that person returned, Mejda would note the time of return on the chit. He then pasted these in a notebook he maintained. At the end of each week, he reviewed this journal and meted out punishment proportional to the length of all unexcused absences. In this manner, we were all studying under Mejda that evening, without, needless to say, wasting the slightest amount of time. Suddenly, I heard the sound from somewhere close behind me. My cousins, who sat facing me, started to scream. "It will eat us!" Promptly, my Mejda swooned over the oil lamp, causing the flame to die and plunging us into complete darkness. Chaos ensued. After some blind groping, the guards outside cheered. Apparently, they had caught someone trying to run away from the scene. They promptly dragged the man up to my uncle. When a lighted lamp arrived, we saw it was Ramkamul, who had been smoking hookah by my uncle's side. Ramkamul was in tears. He claimed to have seen a bear approach and had tried to run away to save himself. In the meantime, Mejda had been nursed back to consciousness. "It was a tiger," Mejda announced with conviction. When the animal showed up at the door to the living room, he and my other cousins had seen it with their own eyes. Where did it go? The bear or tiger or whatever it was? Suddenly, off the guards, Palwan Kishori Singh's voice rang out. "Over there!" He pointed to a shrub next to the pomegranate tree at one corner of our courtyard. In the next second, the thing seemed to jump, landing inside our courtyard, still covered in the shadows of the pomegranate tree. From what people could see, it rather resembled a tiger. Everyone, wherever they had been, beelined for shelter inside the house. Our living room was crammed with bodies in no time. My uncle kept shouting, "Bring me my bludgeon! No, wait, my gun, my gun!" Nobody dared go back out the door, which was uncomfortably close to the pomegranate tree with the tiger on it. At this moment, suddenly, Indro arrived. He was probably passing and entered to check why we were making all that noise. Everybody shouted at once, "Beware, tiger!" At first, caught off guard, he ran into our living room where everyone else was. Then, taking a lantern, he stepped into the courtyard, intending to inspect the tiger. As people murmured about his foolishness, Indra suddenly said, "Nope, not a tiger, I don't think." No sooner had he uttered those words that the tiger stood straight up with its palms joined near its chest. It spoke up tearfully in clear Bengali. "I am no tiger. I am Chinad Bohurupi." Indra burst into laughter. The Bohurupi are a clan who have various day jobs, but as a side hustle, they entertain people by dressing up, typically as mythological characters and sometimes animals too. This man, Chinath, was not a local. He was usually seen in our village and in a couple others near us at this time of the year, seeking supplemental income as a Bohurupi. People did not take kindly to have been utterly fooled. They strongly berated Chinath, who begged forgiveness, repeating that he had not expected those that saw him to not recognize his disguise. He had become confused in the chaos and had simply sought refuge on the tree. He was going to give himself up as soon as things calmed. My uncle was least sympathetic to Chinath's excuses. My aunt interfered, reminding him that moments ago, instead of him and his fearless men, it was the teenager Indranath who had shown the courage to approach the tiger. This only served to further annoy my uncle's wounded pride. To my aunt's consternation, he ordered his men to chop off Chinath's colorful hay-made tail. As soon as his tail was severed, Chinath ran away. Indra now looked at me and said, "So, this is where you live, huh?" "Yes," I said. "Where are you going at this late hour?" "Late?" he exclaimed. "The sun just set. I'm taking my dinghy out to catch fish. Want to come?" "It's pitch dark," I protested. Mysteriously, Indra said, "Well, I cannot get fish at other times. Coming or not? Can you swim?" Nodding my head in a yes and without saying anything further, I found myself slipping away with him, late hour or not. We left the others busy gossiping about the scare Chinath had given them. Soon, I found myself walking through the snake-infested wilderness of Goshai Estate, in Indra's footsteps, as if in a trance. We arrived at the Ganges. The riverbank is pretty steep at this point. Far down below from where we stood, I could see a tiny boat anchored on the gravelled beach, getting roughed by the waves. That was Indra's dinghy, which we were taking out tonight. Showing me a rope dangling from a tree as the route to go down, Indra said, Keep a firm grip. If you slip, you can die from the fall. I will be right behind you. Cautiously, I started to descend, feeling terribly scared, but not protesting. Indro untied the rope and came down the steep bank, using only the exposed tree roots for support. Then, with a carefree laugh, he jumped aboard his dinghy. As soon as he had untied the vessel, the current swept us away. Though it was dark all around, the water glowed with a faint light. I could see Indro at the helm, expertly maneuvering the boat despite the strong current. After a while, I started hearing a dull, periodic noise, resembling something hitting the water. Surprised, I asked Indro what that was. Indro casually replied, "Oh, that's just chunks of mud. The banks are breaking." Then a tad thoughtfully he muttered, "Didn't think about this before. We cannot go that way. After yesterday's rain, the mud is further loosened. We may get squashed under a collapsing chunk. Here, give me a hand, will you?" Indro said, handing me one of the oars. "Row as fast as you can. We must turn the boat." Pointing to an island, he said, "Can you see that? There is a canal next to it. We have to go through there. I will steer the boat, but careful. We have to be quiet. If the bloody fishermen catch us, they will split our heads and bury us in the mud." "But why go there then?" I blurted out in alarm. "Couldn't we go around the other side?" Sensing my distress, Indra smiled a tad nervously, I thought. "The current on the other side is so strong right now that not even a ship can move forward. We will return that way, but for now, we must use the canal." I stopped rowing and said, "Let's drop it then." Almost immediately, the swift current pushed our boat back by several feet. Bringing his face close to me, the very next instant, an irritated Indro hissed, "Coward! Why then did you come?" That stung. I responded by plunging the oars into the water and starting to row with all my might. Indro's face brightened. He assured me that we would be done soon. With a faint smile, he added, "And in the worst case, if the fishermen end up chasing us, just dump the boat and go into the water. Hold your breath and keep going. Head straight for Shotua Island, upriver. After a bit, you can come up for air too. Nobody can see you in this darkness." My voice trembled as I said, "But Shotua Island is miles from here, Indro." Airily, Indro said, "Are, if you get tired, simply float on your back to catch your breath. Besides, you will find many half-burnt logs floating around from unfinished fires. Grab them and drift a while if you like. It's cool." I had no response to make to these confidence-inspiring options. Indro also fell silent. "What will happen to your boat?" The question escaped me abruptly. A nonchalant Indro responded, "Few nights ago, I fled the fishermen just like I described. I simply came back the next day claiming that the person they saw had stolen my boat and that I had nothing to do with it. The fishermen had no choice but to return my boat." So he wasn't just speculating, I thought, aghast. I continued to row and said nothing. We passed the canal without further incident and arrived at the other end of the island. At this point, we could see the lights from the fishermen's lanterns from their boats anchored in the distance. In front of us, we could make out a gigantic net stretched bank to bank. It was propped up with sticks that went down to the riverbed. The net was full of fish. Indro picked a few big ones and loaded up our boat. They were still alive, and their tails hit our boat, making not an insignificant amount of noise. A bit surprised, I asked, "Why so many?" He tartly responded, "You will see," and then added, "Let's go." As we settled on the boat, a swift river current hurled it forward. We didn't need to touch the oars as we were now going with the flow. After a while, I saw the boat changing direction, headed toward a nearby marshland overgrown with maize plants. Surprised, I looked at Indro. "What are you doing?" "Shh," he said, as he pushed the boat forward by hitting the shallow riverbed with his bamboo stick. Indro whispered, "Look, they are coming after us." As I looked to the side, I discerned the silhouette of several boats headed straight at us. We were trapped, I realized, with a sinking heart. There is a gigantic net behind us, and the fishermen are blocking the path forward. The plants in this bit of marsh didn't seem long or deep enough to hide us, with our boat and all. There was nothing to stop those fishermen from killing us, I silently fretted. I was pretty scared. True that Indro hasn't been caught so far, but today could be different. "What will happen if they catch us?" I whispered. "They won't," Indro retorted. Maybe it was my imagination, but his voice sounded a little shaky. We were, by now, several rows of maize plants in, somewhat hidden by the surrounding plants, but Indro kept taking the boat deeper and deeper by pushing his bamboo pole against the riverbed. The water around us wasn't more than 2 or 3 feet deep. After a while, we found the boat refused to budge. We were in the thickest part of the overgrowth. We could hear the fishermen's indistinct voices behind us. They had heard and were searching for the culprits who'd taken their fish. The next moment, I felt the boat tilt one way and then come back up again. Looking around, I found myself sitting alone on the boat. Where did Indro go? I barely managed to get out. "Indro?" "I'm in the water," a reply came from a couple of feet away in the darkness. "What are you doing there?" "This boat is tied to my waist with a rope. I'm going to pull the boat, cut through the marsh. out to the flowing river on the other side. We made slow progress through the maize plants. Then suddenly I heard the beating of canisters. Startled, I asked, "What's that?" The invisible Indro answered, "The farmers on the macha are making noise to keep the warthogs away from their farmland." "Oh, warthogs? Are they here?" "How would I know?" Indro responded with irritation. "They could be anywhere." I sat on the boat, spellbound. First a tiger, even if it was fake. Now warthogs. What next? Although to be fair, it was Indro who was waddling through the waist-deep mud while I sat in the clear on the boat. Some 15 minutes or so had passed when I became aware of something I had been noticing for a while now. From time to time, a stray stalk of the maize plant would shake violently, followed by a soft splashing sound. As I drew Indro's attention to that, he said, "Oh, those are snakes. They like to coil around the maize plant. We are disturbing them, so the poor things are jumping into the water." "Snakes? What sort of snakes?" I asked, hurriedly scooting toward the middle of the boat. "All sorts," came Indro's casual response. "Dhora, Bora, Hamadriyat, Karat. They have been washed up here by yesterday's rain. With no access to land, they have latched onto these maize plants, twisting themselves around the upright stalks to keep dry. I have felt a couple big ones grazing past my feet. Their size makes me think they are boras. But don't worry yourself, the snakes are running scared themselves. They won't bite. And if they do, well, one day we all have to die, don't we?" I sat completely still, afraid to breathe, fearing a snake might just plop onto the boat from the plants we were passing. I marveled at Indro's courage and also felt grateful that he hadn't asked me to get down into that snake-infested hellhole with him. After a while, I began to hear a faint rustling and immediately knew that that was the sound of fast-flowing river. We must be close to the other side of the island. As soon as the dinghy neared the edge of the marsh, Indro jumped aboard. The boat jerked a little, and before we knew it, we felt a tremendous pull from the fast-moving river. Our tiny dinghy was soon on its merry way, breezing with the current. By now, the moon had climbed to the very top. I lay down on the boat, exhausted, and stared at the night sky. Several hours passed without my conscious knowledge. I may have dozed off. When I woke, I found our boat standing motionless next to an open stretch of sandy bank. I could hear dogs barking, implying there was some human settlement close. Indra seemed getting ready to deboard. He said, "Srikanto, I'm going to meet the fishmongers in the village. You wait here. I will be back soon." I nodded my head, still groggy with sleep, as Indra started to walk away. As I sat wondering where we were, Indra came back and said, "By the way, listen carefully. If anyone comes asking for fish, don't give them any. Even if they look just like me, tell them to go away. If they insist, ask them to take the fish themselves, but don't you hand any over. Got it?" "Sure," I said, but before I could ask him more, Indra said, "Good," and then hurried away. Having grown up in a village, I was no stranger to stories about ghosts. I hadn't seen any, but had heard of this particular tribe that loved fish. Handing them fish with your own hands was said to bring swift death upon the person foolish enough to do that. That was the thing Indra had returned to caution me against. As I sat there, now wide awake, I grew more and more anxious. Then I spotted a man who I recognized as Indra coming toward the boat. He was accompanied by 2 additional men. It was when I noticed their shadows in the moonlight that I finally felt relief. That, I knew, was a sure sign that these were flesh and blood living men. The villagers had come for the fish. I saw them paying Indra handsomely for the bounty. So, that's what this all was about. Indra made money by selling stolen fish. All my enjoyment of the past few hours evaporated. I had mistaken thievery for adventure and foolishly risked my life. As our boat resumed its journey, disgust for Indra filled my heart. I felt ashamed to have been his accomplice. Though strangely, I felt some resistance to letting Indra know how I felt. Not that he looked like he would care anyway. "Let's go back," I muttered. Looking at me almost apologetically, Indra said, "I have one more thing to do before we turn back." I said nothing. After a while, our boat entered a still section of the river. The banks were lined with tall, leafy trees. Pointing ahead, Indra said, "See that peepul tree? There is a staircase just past that point. We will stop there for a bit." I had been getting a bad stench for some time now. It suddenly became much stronger, almost unbearable. Turning to Indra, I asked, "What is this smell?" Indra replied, "Rotting flesh. Haven't you heard of the deaths from cholera? The poor cannot afford a funeral. They only touch the mouth of the corpse with fire and then leave them by the river to Mother Ganga." With the motion of his hands, Indra indicated, "This whole stretch is a burning hut." "A burning hut? What on earth does Indra want at a burning hut?" I wondered, beginning to feel sick. As we prepared to dock, we saw the body of a boy, hardly 6 or 7 years old, not dead for long, floating by the bank. While his head was still resting against the steps, the rest of his body had become dislodged by the water. As our boat came to a stop, we heard sounds of animals retreating in a hurry, possibly jackals seeking to hide in the bushes. From the sound of their wings, we also knew large birds, possibly birds of prey, had just flown away from the branches where they'd been waiting for a share of the feast. The boy looked like he was sleeping peacefully. Once off the boat, Indra went to the boy and placing one hand under the boy's neck, the other under his knees, he lifted the dead body out of the water. I cringed. Raised a Brahmin, I felt instinctively queasy about touching a dead body of unknown caste. Indra did not seem to care. As he carried the boy, I followed him. Soon, we arrived at a secluded place, surrounded by trees. Indra laid the body softly on the sand. He then started to cover it with what we could find, twigs, stones, mud. When we finished, I looked at Indra's face. He looked pained. We both knew that the jackals would not be stopped by this meager camouflage. By now, it was close to dawn. The eastern sky was tinged with pink. Indra led the way, and after walking for about 10 minutes, we arrived at a small thatched roof hut surrounded by a fence, tucked away in the middle of nowhere amidst huge trees and bushes. Indra unlatched the gate and we entered. In a corner of the small courtyard, we saw a handful of goats and chickens. The animals started making noise, agitated by our presence. Then I jumped back, startled, as my eyes fell on an enormous python that lay stretched across the courtyard. Laughing, Indra said, "Not to worry. He is completely harmless. His name is Rohim." Bending, he picked Rohim up with both hands and put him to the side. Recovering from my shock, I noticed that a thin man sat half-lying on a shabby-looking bed on the veranda ahead. His matted hair was tied in a knot on his head, and beaded garlands of various sizes adorned his neck. He wore something that had once been yellow. I had not to this point recognized the man Indra was addressing as Shaji, but now I did. He was a snake charmer. I had indeed seen him before performing snake tricks around our neighborhood. Shaji handed Indra his smoking things. Dutifully, Indra started to prepare a joint for him. Taking the loaded pipe from Indra, Shaji gave it a long puff. Then, breaking into a vigorous cough, he extended the pipe to Indra, who refused it politely. They started to converse in a low voice. I stood waiting, not understanding much of what they were saying. Then, abruptly, Shaji burst in anger, uttering profanities unlike anything I had ever heard before. And then, as his cough returned with a vengeance, Shaji lay back against the wall. Within seconds of his cough abating, Shaji had fallen asleep, starting to snore. Neither Indra nor I said anything for a while. I still had no idea what business Indra could possibly have at a place like this. Just when I was getting ready to ask, he looked at me and said, "Do you want to see snake tricks, Srikanto?" "Who will do it?" I asked suspiciously. "Me," he said excitedly, leaving me speechless as he ran inside the hut. He soon emerged holding a small covered basket and a snake flute. Panicked, I asked, "Have you ever handled a snake before?" I didn't get to finish my sentence. Indra had nudged the lid of the basket open and started blowing into the flute he now held with both hands. Immediately, a huge hooded hamadryad materialized, growing continuously in height as it stood straight up to its full length. It looked very angry to have been disturbed, and soon, with lightning speed, it ducked its head to bite, luckily only hitting the rounded part of the snake flute. Quickly dropping the flute, Indra jumped back. The snake slithered away toward the veranda. I heard Indra mumbling, "This is not the guy I'm familiar with. This is a new one, and boy, is it wild." Shocked and irritated at Indra for the predicament he put us in, I asked, "Shaji is sleeping on the veranda. What if it bites him?" As Indra hesitated, my eyes fell on the gate where I saw a woman about to enter. She struck me as really pretty in her gypsy clothes, with an unexpectedly serene and intelligent look on her face. She was holding a bunch of freshly collected dry wood in her hand. Indra, who had seen her too, yelled, "Don't enter, Onodadi!" That snake got out from the basket and went toward the hut. The woman looked quizzically at Indra as she tried to assess the situation. Sheepishly, Indra admitted he had tried to show Shaji's tricks to me, all by himself, when the snake fled. Ignoring Indra's suggestion to awaken Shaji and let him deal, Onodadi entered the courtyard and lowered the heap of wood in her hand. Looking sharply around, she neared a bush and stooped low to investigate. After a few swift hand movements, she got up with the hamadryad held between her hands, its mouth clamped shut in a single-fisted grip. Both of us watched her in awe as Onodadi put the snake back in the basket. Onodadi returned to us, smiling kindly at each before admonishing Indra not too harshly. "It was reckless of you to fool around with this one, Indra." Waving his hands in dismissal, Indra said, "I am not scared. Shaji has the antidote. If the snake bit me, I would just wake him. You know. All he needs to do is to touch the poison stone to the wound. It'll draw out all the poison." The air of amused tolerance disappeared abruptly from Onodadi's face. Gravely, she said, Indro, how many times do I need to tell you that this is a lie? There is no stone on earth that can do what you say. Certainly, we don't have it. This statement had a noticeable effect on Indro. It seemed he had heard this from her before and did not take it seriously. But perhaps he didn't expect Anodadi to joke about it with me there with him. So now, he stood looking at her for a moment. Then, going toward Shaji, Indro started to shake him. When Shaji woke, Indro asked why he had lied to Indro for all these months. From their agitated conversation, I understood that Shaji had in fact been stringing Indro along, dangling the possibility of letting him have at this miraculous stone, and even gotten money out of Indro with that false promise. Shaji roared, "Who said it's a lie?" Indro pointed to Anodadi. Shaji got up and, stumbling toward her, challenged her hotly. An irritated, disappointed Indro was in no mood for this drama. He grabbed my hand and dragged me away. We had been walking quietly for 5 minutes or so when Indro mentioned that Anodadi was of gentlefolk from a well-to-do family. Somehow, I had no difficulty believing that about her. Turning to me, he said, "I don't understand why she ever chose this life." That's when we heard a sharp cry from the direction of the hut. Indro started to run back, with me right behind. When we reached the hut, we found Anodadi lying on the ground, a fresh wound on her forehead that was bleeding. Shaji stood there with a piece of wood in hand. Clearly, he had hit her unconscious for exposing him. Indro lunged toward Shaji, and the two started fighting. I didn't realize that Shaji was that strong a man. If I hadn't intervened, Indro would have been in deep trouble. It was quite a bit of effort to get them to back down. We returned to tend to Anodadi. As Indro sprinkled water on her face, she moaned. Shaji, in the meantime, went inside the hut, his feet unsteady. When Shaji emerged from the hut, the basket with the snake was in his hand. Opening the lid, he let the snake out and picked up his flute. As he played, we saw him bringing his face dangerously close to the fierce-looking animal, hissing angrily at him. Meanwhile, Anodadi had recovered just enough to sit up. When she saw what Shaji was up to, she called out in alarm, "Watch out! You are unsteady!" Before her sentence finished, the snake took a swipe at Shaji again. This time, Shaji was just a tad late. The snake had caught him on his temple. Enraged, Shaji rose up, grabbing the snake by its head. With its feet, he had pinned its tail to the ground. He started to pull on the snake with all his might. We watched, spellbound, as he seemed to stretch the snake out. After a while, his hold slackened. Soon, he fell dead on the ground, and the snake plopped dead right next to him. I sat there, stunned by everything that had transpired in the past few moments. Afterward, we helped Anodadi prepare a grave to bury Shaji's body. Anodadi refused to take any of the money Indro offered, even though he told her he had got it solely for her. Repeatedly, Indro asked, "Where will you go?" Anodadi said nothing. It was bright morning by the time the three of us sat quietly around Shaji's recently closed grave under the huge tree Anodadi had chosen next to the flowing Ganga. That's when she finally broke her silence. She started to tell her story, and I have not forgotten it to this day. "He was my husband," Anodadi began. "He had fled after raping my widowed elder sister. No one heard from him for 7 years. Then I saw him again a few weeks ago in front of our house, looking exactly how you saw him, a snake charmer. The audacity of it. He sets up shop in front of our house, the very place where he had committed an unforgivable crime. Nobody recognized him, but I did, and I confronted him. He told me he had come to take me, his wife, with him. He was my husband. My duty was to be with him. I left home to do my duty. I knew I was leaving behind everything I had ever known or held dear. I was embracing permanent shame by dishonoring my family when I stole away with a stranger under cover of darkness. My interaction with Indra also reduced considerably after that incident. I would wonder from time to time why Anodadi left home with that rascal. I had to grow up before I began to understand. Anodadi grew up with the belief that she could not disobey her husband. She could not fight that belief despite his abominable actions. But she fought everything else with unwavering courage, from becoming estranged from those she loved to embracing economic hardships and social outrage. Her story left a deep impression on my mind. The proud, beautiful, affectionate, lion-hearted Anodadi I saw was blacklisted by society. How could I ever trust conventional wisdom, especially when it came to judging the character of a woman after knowing Anodadi's story? Little did I know how Indru and Anodadi's fire had shaped me in that one life-changing night of my life, giving me courage to rebel against conventional wisdom again and again, especially in the matter of finding love and friendship in the most unexpected of circumstances. Thank you for listening.